So Pete, can you let me know, can you see that now?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. So I just wanted to, before we get on to Kat, Katrina Houghton from ID Profile, just to give you a little bit of background about Regional Development Australia. And I apologise to those who have heard this before, so I'll keep it fairly short and sweet. RDA, we are actually partly funded by the Department of Infrastructure, so federal government, and there are 50 RDAs across all of Australia. So pretty much every piece of land in Australia has an RDA that is representative, and every RDA is set up as their own independent organisation. So we're run by an independent board of volunteers to actually ascertain what are the priorities, particularly for Darling Downs Southwest, but still under the Department of Infrastructure funding agreement, which is a charter. Our region is that little space of Queensland there. It's about 23% of Queensland. We have 10 local councils, 7 state members, 2 federal members. And our role is to basically be a coordinator and a connector across the 3 levels of government, business and industry and community. Under the federal government charter, so that Department of Infrastructure funding, we have some priorities that we need to fulfil, and one is improving access to funding. So you can see today is a big part of us delivering that. We partly fund ID Profile, which Kat's going to run us through. And the reason we do that is we want a portal that's publicly available for everybody to access that is applying for grants, and that's how we get better quality grant applications going in using real data rather than we think and we feel this is a great project. It's data that will help us win more projects for Darling Downs Southwest, and we see that as straight away an economic stimulus for the region. So that's a big part of today. The other thing that we have got is a grants portal on the RDA website, and I'll get to that later. And we summarise up all of the grants and funding that are available across the region, and across fed and state. And that gets updated every month. So if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, I'd recommend going to the RDA site and subscribing to it. And once a month, you'll get a reminder that the grants have been updated, but the actual grants sit there 24/7. So you can look at them at any stage. Our second priority is to coordinate progressing more projects across the region. So quite often we're brought in to facilitate meetings between different stakeholders or the different levels of government to help a project progress or get rid of a barrier. We're the independent organisation that's called on to facilitate some of those because we don't have skin in the game, and help coordinate that and make sure that project progresses. Our third priority is actually feeding back to the federal government. So we never saw this as strong as COVID, obviously. We report to Minister Nola Marino. She sits under McCormack, and during COVID, we were on 3 teleconferences a week, feeding back what we heard on the ground in regards to JobKeeper, JobSeeker. When there wasn't something for the childcare, we fed that back. And some of the stuff you've seen announced in the budget came from the RDA network and those meetings with Minister Marino. So we would encourage you to use us as your conduit to federal government and keep letting us know of things that we can feed back to those calls. We're now on 1 teleconference a week with Minister Marino, but please keep feeding us that information. So there are 3 priorities. Our board have got 4 portfolios that they have prioritised for the region, and they're on the screen there. Investment attraction, employment and skills, which is probably the one we spend most of our time on. And coming up very soon, we have got the virtual jobs fair. So if you're trying to fill jobs in your region, get on to employedtoowoomba.net.au. The reason it's Toowoomba and not all of Darling Downs Southwest is that particular activity is facilitated by RDA, but it's actually funded by DESVIT, the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training, for state government funding. And their thing was that it needed to be Toowoomba. However, for the virtual jobs fair, we've sent it out to our whole network. And if somebody's looking for jobs across Darling Downs Southwest, feel free to register to the virtual jobs fair, so we won't turn you away. And third for portfolio, in no particular order, is value chains, market development and logistics. So this is where things like very broad regional projects that's going to have a broad effect, like inland rail, digital connectivity fall under this portfolio. And then innovation, entrepreneurship and disruption is our fourth portfolio. I usually in the RDA talk through the fact that economy ID and how you should use it for grants, but we've got Kat here today and that's her specialty, so I'm going to handball to her. But before I do, I did want to just send you this link to the funding page on our website. So if you go to that, that's where the listing of all the grants and funding is. And the other one that we've got on there is the innovation document. So a lot of grants and funding is for not-for-profits or councils, but there are some grants and programs available for business. And this document here, the innovation document, we will email this to you, to anyone who registered for this webinar. This innovation document does a really great summary of all of the grants and programs that are available from the state government and from the federal government. So if you are a business looking for grants and programs, that's more your document to go to. For not-for-profits, go to the RDA link. The business ones are on there as well, but there's plenty for not-for-profits. But more what today is about is making sure that you've got you know how to navigate the ID profile portal so that you can access better data to make sure that your grant application you're putting in is a better application. So I'm going to now hand over to Kat, and she's going to go through her some COVID data for the Merway region. And Karen, as I said, we can send you the Quilpie copy of that. So she's going to run through some COVID data, and then we're really going to get into her actually navigating the site. So we're going to go on the site live, and she's going to navigate around some of the industries. We heard from Jenny and from Peter, so we know that youth and health is an area for Jenny, and we know that tourism is an area for Peter, so we will have a little look at some of those specifically. If you've got any questions, please shoot them into the chat. So down the bottom of your screen, you should have a chat button that you can press on, and you just type them into the notes area for chat, and I will, when there's a good spot, interrupt Kat and make sure that we get those questions answered. And if for some reason it's a question you don't want to ask publicly or you don't get a chance to today, the admin@RDA email that you would have got your registrations through and from, that's Tim Smith, my assistant. He will answer them for you if he can, and anything we can't answer, we then send to Kat for further investigation. The other thing too is this presentation that Kat is about to run through and the PowerPoint that I just ran through, plus the innovation doc and the virtual jobs fair, you will get copies of all of those. So don't feel like you're missing something or you've got to madly be taking notes, although that would be great, but don't panic because there's a lot of data on some of these screens. We will send it to you. All right, that is definitely enough from me. I'm going to silence my computer and hand over to Kat.
unmute now. Can we hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes.
Yay.
You'll have to go back to the beginning.
I'll go back to the beginning.
Thank you everyone for letting me know in the chat.
How am I going back? Okay, so we'll start again, guys. So what I was talking about was the idea that ID provides economic and community data to look at what are the changes that are happening in your community and how those changes can impact upon your grant applications, how they can help to make business decisions. And we work with local governments all over Australia. We actually work with over 350 local governments to talk to them and their local businesses and their community groups about how their economies are changing, how their people are changing, and what that means for their decision making moving forward. The first thing I'm going to talk about today is the national, state and local impacts of coronavirus. And then, so at the end, we'll really drill down into what's happening in Merway. Now, whilst directly Merway hasn't been necessarily affected by the coronavirus in terms of cases, what we are seeing though is some of the future changes that are going to happen will present some opportunities, but also some challenges for the region. And it's really about being aware of what that means for the West. So the first thing we know is that the impacts vary from region to region. And that's one due primarily to the number of cases that have evolved in your area. So we know that Victoria and New South Wales, sort of the economic powerhouses of the Australian economy, have fared a lot worse than Queensland, and we can see the recovery in Queensland is actually somewhat underway. Our service sector exposure, our exposure to international exports, international imports, and also international tourism. So international tourism has played a key role in really bolstering a number of economies in the past, 5 to 10 years in particular, and now we're seeing those regions very exposed to those changes. We've also got population drivers, so areas that are highly dependent on international migration to drive their economy and drive their development will no longer have that significant growth in numbers of young people, particularly because that's where we see a lot of our international migration from coming into their regions. So the virus is not yet under control, and we know that each day there's about 60,000 additional cases around the world. And we know that in Australia, whilst we are relatively immune, we've had our hiccup in Victoria, around the world we're going back into lockdown. And Victoria is coming towards the end of the second wave, and we know there's been some implications for Victoria. And we're looking at, and I guess looking forward to the day that we're able to open that border and start to see our southern friends coming up for tourism opportunities, but also population movers as well. So when the world catches a cold, and we know that the impacts from this particular crisis are much worse than that of the GFC, because this time what we find is that developing countries have also been significantly impacted by the crisis, and we can see it's almost double the impact from the GFC, more than double, I should say. Australia's major trading partners are expected to contract by around 3%. We've started to see a little bit of that come back, particularly with China and steel production, and we're starting to see some shifts in a number of sectors. But exporting has slowed down, and you'll know from your communities, talking to your businesses that are exporters and that sort of thing, that exporting and importing has been difficult for a period, and that's literally because we just haven't had open borders. We've got goods and in our ports at the moment waiting to be distributed. We've got certain big Kmart and Big W and chains like that finding it difficult to get stock. So it's a really interesting period for us and consumerism across the board. So the record is over, and quarterly growth in Australian GDP has fallen very hard. And we can compare that back to the 1970s when we talk about sort of the Great Recession of the 1970s, when we had our oil crisis, and we can see how much more significant the coronavirus has been for our GDP. People receiving job assistance payments. So this is job seeker payments and youth allowance. So this isn't job keeper. This is our unemployment benefits. It has risen to 11% and it hasn't fallen. Hospitality sector, of course, has been hit really hard, mainly due to social distancing impacts, but we've also got art and rec. Ag, forestry and fishing we know is coming back, and it's starting to fuel a number of economies that are making a revival at the moment, particularly in Queensland. The Sunshine State. So now we'll really focus on that statewide impact and recovery. And here we talk about, again, our impacts vary from region to region. You can see our state final demand, so what we call our gross state product. We can see there Queensland has fallen by 5.9% compared to 8.6 and 8.5 in New South Wales and Victoria. And when we look across to the chart on the right there, and we look at our payroll job impacts, you can actually see that Queensland is starting to make a revival, and we're starting to press towards that index, that 100 index there, where we want to get back to. And you can see how Victoria has had much more of a heavy impact. So we're already sort of on our way, certainly, to recovery. But our unemployment is higher in the state than the national average, which we've seen that for quite a while, and more people have left the labour force. Now, we know that our participation rates in Queensland are often lower than other regions. I think that's partly to do with the fact that we're a lifestyle destination. But certainly during recessions, we will see that participation rate fall, particularly in Queensland. Jobs growth has recovered to July, but we still have an extra 150,000 people on job assistance. Okay, so that's our job seeker and youth allowance recipients. Coastal tourism hotspots with international market reliance and inner Brizzy were hit the hardest. So you can see here, regions ranked in terms of greatest fall in payroll jobs March to April. So when the crisis really took hold and we had those social distancing implications, we can see Gold Coast, Cairns, Sunny Coast, Brisbane inner city, the top four. Now, Brisbane inner city almost died during that period. You could have heard a pin drop in the middle of Brizzy, and any type of inner city location, any type of central district, whatever you want to call it, within even smaller communities were impacted during that period because we just didn't have the clientele coming in, buying coffees, buying lunch. And that sort of thing. So the Gold Coast, Cairns, Sunny Coast, Brisbane inner city, where we can see our regions ranked in terms of our closest return to payroll jobs. So those economies that have really looked at recovery, they're staring in the face of recovery, Toowoomba, Central Queensland, Moreton Bay and Brisbane East. Now, some of those economies are heavily ag-based, and so that has helped to fuel that, as well as mining. We can see the Queensland Outback, Darling Downs, Maranoa, 4.1% down on 4.2% down on last year. So domestic visitation to regional areas has increased substantially, and this is a highly significant industry that is going to present some really very strong opportunities for regional Queensland and regional Australia. In a number of destinations that have really pushed domestic tourism and really changed the way that they market to the domestic audience as opposed to an international audience, have done extremely well. Toowoomba, Scenic Rim, and the Sunshine Coast in and around where I live have certainly paved the way to display how important it is to change that messaging, to really focus on what that domestic tourist can bring to the region and what do they want in comparison to, say, for example, backpackers or Chinese visitors or whatever it might be that is your usual dependent tourists. So it's really, they've really changed. They've done some really exciting things to entice that Brizzy audience to come to them, and people are a lot more wanting to travel a lot more into our regional areas, and have really, there's been a change in preference there, and that's going to go on for some time. Regardless of a vaccine, people are reluctant to travel as much as previously, particularly on aeroplanes, or to look at international travel. So domestic tourism is where it's going to sit for at least the next 2 years. So Queensland's more vulnerable than other states to international flight restrictions, but less vulnerable in terms of international students. So we're a little bit shielded in terms of the impacts from students. And we know that in New South Wales and Victoria, there's whole apartment blocks at the moment that are vacant with empty cars because international students were unable to return to university during that early period in March. So Queensland will experience much slower population growth due to falls in overseas migration and less domestic movements. However, once those national restrictions are lifted, we may see an influx of domestic migrants, particularly from New South Wales and Victoria. So you can see there Queensland relies very heavily, much more than the other states, on our net interstate migration, particularly from New South Wales. But there is a real opportunity now to really look at those our southern counterparts, to say this is an opportunity for us to get some of those guys into our state to support our population growth moving forward, so it's less of an impact on our economies. And we know that the last time this happened, when Victoria was very heavily hit, much harder than Queensland in terms of their economy in the 1990s recession, we had over $90,000 interstate residents move to our region, which was a bit of a very high point in terms of our migration. So we believe that we will see an influx from Victoria, and what that looks like and where they go, we will start to see that unfold as the borders open and we start to see those movements start to take place. So it's a bit of a bumpy road to recovery, and there's some different phases that we're going to go through. And the first phase was really around those social distancing impacts, which Queensland's, gone through, and I feel like we've come out the other side of, simply because our case numbers have been very low. Then what follows from our social distancing impacts is this falling investment and spending as we start to see the economy contract, and people start to save more and are more reluctant to invest in R&D or new product. The third phase we will see when JobKeeper program starts to ramp down, and what implications will that have for our regions. And then we'll also have these long run structural changes as people start to use what they've learnt during this crisis in order to move forward and look at how and where they move to. There's a lot of talk of, we have rental shortages in majority of regional areas throughout Queensland. We have had the highest amount of land sales in Cairns since June last year. There's some really exciting things happening in regions as we see people moving to lifestyle destinations or cheaper destinations to work, because now we've had this, introduction to technology. And people there's a greater appetite to move out of those city centres. So when we have a look in our second stage, we can see our households and businesses have started to cut spending, and we can see our savings, our household confidence is falling, and our savings is up around those 1970 levels. We can also see our business spending on R&D is back to 2006 levels, which is something as a nation we're going to need to watch and make sure that we're investing in research and development for our businesses. So many jobs are vulnerable when JobKeeper is removed and will weigh on household spending and confidence. And JobKeeper has kept many workers off the unemployment roll. About 81,000 Queenslanders are receiving JobKeeper but are working 0 hours. And you can see there Douglas, Whitsunday, Noosa have the highest percentage of people employed but not working, which is no surprise. So it's going to be something we're going to have to keep an eye on. For this particular region, it's not as necessary, but it's certainly something that we need to ensure that we're aware of, particularly if those things happen in some of our more urban and metro centres, what that means for somewhere like Merway. So the Queensland economy is expected to outperform the nation, which is great, and we've already started to see some of that recovery. So let's have a look at our regional impacts. So initially the largest job impacts were in regional areas. However, now we're starting to see those impacts in those heavier impacts in metro and urban areas, particularly around our border LGAs. So those border LGAs, you know, like the Gold Coast, even Gundy, when we moved down the border between New South Wales and Victoria, there's been some really difficult times for those regions that sit in those border localities. This is our local LGA, local government area job seeker changes. So this is according to your local government area, and we can see, you know, we can see little Douglas there in the north, the very deep dark red. That's a 120 to 159% increase in job seeker payments. We've also got our dark red areas down here in southeast Queensland, and we can see the impacts of the virus on the Gold Coast there. We can also see in Noosa, you know, there's been some economies that have been hit super hard during this crisis.
John, which council is that red one in the middle there?
I have no idea.
Would that be Winton?
No, it's Sparky. It's Buck Holden, I think.
Buck Holden.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is.
Reliance on
Because
tourism?
the one to the left of it's Barcoo, and the one above to the left is Longreach. Actually, it might be Longreach. You know, you never went there. Just let us work that out.
Pete, would that be tourism related as to why they're red and so many, you know, when you look at that, it's more the coastal area that obviously has had the increase in job seeker payments, and rural and remote, really, we're doing okay, you know. But why that one red one? You got any intel?
I reckon it's Longreach.
It's Longreach, and it'll be because of the tourists, because it's so heavily reliant on tourism.
Yeah. Okay.
And given the date range in that, you know, if that date range was post-August, it might be different because their tourism bounced back quite strongly, but it's definitely Longreach. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. The date is March to August, so that would make sense, Pete.
Yep.
Perfect.
Sorry for the
No,
interruption.
mate, good.
It's been bothering me what that big red blob is in the middle. Tom.
So agriculture regions have been less exposed to initial COVID-19 impacts. You know, this is mainly due to demand, you know, panic buying. We've also, you know, but previous to COVID, we also had the bushfires and of course the impacts of the drought. So certainly the agricultural regions were not out of the woods when COVID hit, but we have started to see some programs, particularly in some of the metro areas around, you know, the buying local food, all of that sort of thing. And I think some of those things have worked really well to keep things afloat. Now, this is a framework to understand our regional impacts, and this is really about looking at each of those, I guess, stages and saying, okay, social distancing impacts, you know, what were the economic impacts of that? What were the industries that were really hit? And what are some of the geographic and place impacts that we can talk about that you guys can create policy or think about for your local businesses around what can we do to help those guys in the in our CBDs and our activity centres? Our falling investment and spending, you know, that's due to unemployment increasing, you know, businesses investing less in their companies, their export demand declining. And we've got all of these industries and geographic impacts, our long run damage and opportunities. Youth disengagement is something that's going to be really significant. And that's simply because our youth, and in particular our women, have been, you know, affected quite heavily from this crisis simply because of the impact on industries like retail, hospitality, and that sort of thing. So the Merway recovery, how is Merway performing? And we can see here, this is Merway prior to the COVID health crisis. Now with our economic data, we update our data yearly, okay? And it normally happens, we normally get our data sets at about this time, and they're normally released in February, March of next year. So it's a really important time to look back at the data and say what happened over the last year that was a response to a new project that you guys might have implemented, an event that happened. You're able to have a look at how your industries have changed over a 1 year period. But we can see going into the crisis, Merway perhaps wasn't performing as strongly as some of the other areas within the Darling Downs Southwest region, and there'd been a fall from 2017. But the Merway industry base is less vulnerable to COVID-19. So you can see there, ag, forestry and fishing, healthcare and social assistance are major industries. With public admin and safety, with retail trade is up there, but certainly not as high as Queensland. Same with accommodation and food services. So our industry base is very different to what we would see in other areas that have been more vulnerable to the COVID crisis. So here's our headline estimates. So Merway is not as hard hit as the rest of Queensland. And certainly when you look at these figures, you can see that you guys are performing very, very well. And we have a look at your GRP change. What this is telling me is this is the impacts or the change in the impacts between September of last year and September of this year. And we can see that you guys are actually performing better now than you were September last year prior to the crisis. Same with your local job change. So you actually are performing better than you were last year. Employed resident change, we can see 7.9% compared to last year as well. But if you look at it, it'd be only a 7.4% change without the JobKeeper scheme. So there are still some employed residents that are receiving some JobKeeper payment. And this table is actually flipped. So we can see it's the negative sits on the top part of the bar and the positive sits on the bottom side of the bar. So Merway certainly performing much better than regional Queensland and Australia. So the industries that are finding strength, and we know ag, forestry and fishing is coming back and performing quite well, healthcare and social assistance. So the only industries that, you know, we've seen a bit of a decline in, accommodation and food services, transport, postal, warehousing, construction and art and recreation services. So the rest of industries in the region have actually found quite a significant amount of strength, and they're helping to fuel the economy in this area. So this is Merway resident jobs compensated by JobKeeper payments. So this actually gives you your numbers of people who are currently on your JobKeeper payments. So when we talk about March next year and we say, okay, this is a significant period where JobKeeper at this point in time they're saying is going to be finished, that this would be how many jobs potentially are going to be coming off JobKeeper payments. So you can see there, it's not a huge amount of jobs. We can see about 4.7 in healthcare and social assistance. And some of this, to be honest, with the JobKeeper payment, it does distort some of the figures in some ways, as people may be on JobKeeper but working as well. Our increased number of job seeker recipients. So I showed you that map before of the changes in job seeker recipients, and we can see here what happened from March to September. So we can see that from March to September, we had an increase in the number of people accessing job seeker benefits. Okay, so that's March to September when the crisis hit. Now we want to have a look at, well, how are we recovering, or are we recovering? And we can see here from July to September, we've had some recovery in the Merway area as people move off job seeker and are re-employed. So we can see there what's happening. We can see Peru and Quilpie, we've actually had an increase in July, from July to September of people receiving JobKeeper as well as Ballon is another area. So certainly some interesting things to look at, and certainly it's very dependent on your industry base and what's happening in your economy, how your infrastructure spending is going, what project delivery you've got on the go at any one time as well.
Sorry, just the other thing, you got Houghton, Peru, that they were increasing.
Yep.
Oh, that's right, September.
Yeah, so July to September. So that just shows that perhaps that.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So just not as, you know, perhaps there may have been a business that closed during that particular month. So what will happen is this data is updated monthly. So the October data should be coming out soon to be able to tell us then what's happened. So it's going to continually change. This is going to be a moving feast for a period of time until we get people, hopefully, off job seeker benefits. What we want to see in economies is every time this data comes out, so we look from September to October, we see some more recovery and some more recovery.
Can I just note to everybody, there's only 9 of our 10 councils there. So Baloo is missing. And I got this funny phone call from Margaret Blade, who is the Director of Regional Development Australia, Brisbane. And she rang me and she goes, Trude, I got the report. This is in the middle of COVID. I got this report on job seeker and JobKeeper payments. And I had to Google where is Baloo, because they are the only council area in all of Australia with 0 JobKeeper and job seeker payments. So then she rang me because, you know, we work together very closely to say, I now know where Baloo is. And that was why she had looked it up. So I just thought I'd let you guys know it's not that cats accidentally missed them out of there. It's because they have 0 data to put in there.
The population is very tiny.
And anybody who can work is working.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So our move to recovery, and I'm not going to go through the regional implications and challenges. You guys can read that when you get the presentation, but I want to talk about the opportunities. And the number one opportunity is around our tourism strategy and our target for the return of our domestic tourism market. And we know that in Queensland, in some regional areas at the moment, that demand is very high for tourism product. And it's certainly dependent upon how we market to that domestic market, and particularly the busyness of our domestic market. But also, you know, I think Bernard Salt talked about these guys that are sort of cashed up now that they're not going on overseas holidays and they have a bucket load of annual leave. So it's thinking about how we form a part of that. Activity centre strategies are going to be really important to deal with higher vacancies. Infrastructure projects will be key as well, starting to bring down those job seeker participants. Opportunities for remote working is going to be really, really important. That's something that is happening. We can see a lot of people moving from, even from Brisbane out to, you know, other destinations where they're able to work from home as well. So we've got agricultural, food, local manufacturing, supply chain links, making sure that we're able to, you know, ensure that we have good connectivity of supply between our industries, transport and logistics, the growth in online shopping, skills development, making sure we're looking after our youth and our women. Mental health programs is going to be really important as well, and the new job trainer funds as they come out. So there's some really great things there that you guys can work on and certainly tap into to be able to support growth in this region as well. So that's it for my presentation. What I'm going to do now is still working. Is that working? Let's wait for it. So I'm going to share my, I might stop sharing and then go back in.
Yeah,
we did that yesterday. Yeah. Okay. We're actually going to go into the tool now. So we're going to go onto the tool, and I'm going to show you some areas that I think are really important for you guys to have a good understanding of, and just to know where to find this information. So I'll run through and I'll go to some different things. Happy for you guys to ask questions, and we can find out things as we move along. And I'll talk a little bit about the Quilpie stuff as well, because we've got a guest from Quilpie, so we can run through that as well.
If anyone on the call is not familiar with the sites at all, the stuff that Kat is now showing you through is totally and utterly publicly available right now. So you can go and that's all there. And the layout for all 10 of our councils for Southwest Red and for RDA are all the same. So even though you might not be seeing your own council, it's all the same layout.
Yep. Absolutely. And the only things that come behind a password are your economic impact model and your event impact calculator. And both of those, Trudy's got the password for and can share with you guys as you need. So let's head on to the community profile. Now, the community profile draws data from the census. Okay, there's a few other little sources, but 99% of the data on here comes from our census that happens every 5 years. And it's really important data because it talks to us about our community, and it talks to us about how our community is changing over time. So we can see what's happening, how are we providing for our community? Should we be providing, you know, parks as opposed to aged care facilities? So it's really using this data to be able to match our decision making in our communities. And we can see this is the RDA homepage. It gives us a map of the RDA region. And when we come down here, we get this, what I call a menu. Okay, and it's a menu of all the different pieces of data that you can find in community profile. So if you want to look at the highest level of schooling in your region because you're going for a grant looking at education and you want to be able to say, well, we don't think people are finishing school in our area, or we have a lack of qualifications, you can find that information directly under education. And if I actually just click on there, I'm not going to, but if I just click on there, it'll take me straight to the qualifications page. Now, when I move up here, I'm going to come firstly to this area called population highlights. And population highlights gives me a really good snapshot of my region. And when I come onto my area page, I can collect data for Balonne, Baloo, Gundy, Maranoa, Merway, Peru, Quilpie, Southern Downs, Toowoomba, Western Downs, and the Southwest Reds region as well. So it's really important if you want to look at a different area, you can click on that and it will give you information on that particular local government area. So our population is 4,295, declined by 22 from the previous year. When we move down here, it gives me some information. So I can look at this straight away. And if I've never traveled to Charleville before, I grew up in these sorts of regions, so I understand the areas. But if I've never been here before, if I'm sending a colleague from Melbourne, this is the page where they go to and go, okay, median age 39, a much higher proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders than the rest of regional Queensland. Couples with children, a bit lower. We can see there than RDA and regional Queensland. Older couples with children, lower. A higher percentage of lone person households. Medium and high density housing is less than the rest of Queensland. So on and so forth. We can go right down, guys, into overseas born, university attendance, university qualifications, our participation rate, you know, a whole bunch of data we can get on this region to be able to say, okay, I start to understand what this place could look like. Okay, and what you can do with this page is you can actually export it into a PDF. And if you export it into a PDF, I put my email address in there and it sends it to me and I can just print it straight out. Now you can do that for any of your regions that you want to. The next thing I'm going to go to, actually I'll look at our population estimates. And when we come down here, this just gives us an overview of what the population was in terms of numbers over a period of time. And we can compare our percentage change to regional Queensland. Okay, and we can see how there's been population decline in Merway during that period, a little bit of growth in 18, and then we've had a decline again in 2019. So it just gives you a bit of it gives you a different way of viewing that data around your population. The next thing I'm going to look at is our 5-year age groups. And this is significantly important for planning. Regardless of what way you cut the pie, you need to have a good understanding of what's happening in your community. And when I move down here, I've got my area set as Merway Shire. My benchmark area, I can compare to RDA DDSW. I can compare to regional Queensland, Queensland and Australia. It is important to know that if you are going for a grant application with the state government, you will need to compare your shire or your local government area with Queensland. If you are going for a grant with the Australian government, you need to compare it with Australia. So we'll click on Queensland for the minute. The first thing we get, guys, is a big data table. So this gives us our exact numbers of each of those age categories. And you can export this file. So if you want to export that into Excel or Word, you can do so. You might want to combine age groups. You might want to talk about 0 to 9-year-olds, 10 to 19-year-olds, 20 to 29-year-olds. So you can combine all those figures. You can use Excel to do that. You also, below the chart, below the table, you get your source. So source, ABS, Census of Population and Housing, compiled and presented by ID. Then we get into my favorite part, which is my charts. And here what we want to look at is what is our dominant age structure compared to Queensland. And we can see here our dominant age structure is 0 to 4-year-olds. And up here, our 50 to 59-year-olds is quite dominant as well. We've also got these 25 to 29-year-olds. But really, that's our dominant age structure. When we move down here, though, this is talking to me about our change in our age structure. So what's changing in the region between 2011 and 2016? How did our age structure change? And we can see we have this shift towards an aging population. And here we've got our workforce, our workers that are taking away these little people moving out of the region. So we've got these dominant groups, which down here we talk about, and we've got our emerging groups. Now, you guys can use this information as part of your grant application. So if you want to be able to talk about the aging of the Merway region, this would be a good chart to talk about around. We can see these things happening in our region. We can see that we've got this decline in our younger working population. We need to think about how we keep them in the community. We also need to think about how people age in place. What does that mean for healthcare? What does that mean for you know, other services in the region to avoid people having to go to Brisbane or other central locations like Toowoomba? So that's our 5-year age groups. The next one I'm going to take you to is birthplace. Okay, and I'm just giving you guys a bit of a trip around the site, and then you can go on and really have a good look at it. Here we've got our area as Merway Shire, Queensland again, and then we've got all of our totals. I'm going to move straight down to our charts. We can see Vietnamese, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Philippines. Now, when we look at percentage of the population, these figures are small. But what we want to look at is how has that changed over time? And we've had a decline in our Vietnamese, decline in New Zealand, decline in United Kingdom, but we've had this growth here in terms of our Filipino population. But it's only 12 people. But certainly it's something that we should keep an eye on and be able to see how that's changing in our community as well. So certainly, you know, this is a good tool to look at as your population starts to grow and shift and change as well. So we've got here, let's go down to education. We'll talk about our qualifications. So how qualified is our community? And we can see 18.1% of people in Merway had a vocational qualification, lower than Queensland. Let's have a look. So we come down here and we get our data table, and we can see here a much higher percentage of no qualifications in the Merway Shire. We're a bit below in terms of all our other fields. And let's have a look at how we've changed. So we've had a shift away from our no qualifications. So we can see people are becoming more qualified in the region. But certainly this is something when we look at skills and development funding around being able to say, well, look, yes, we've had some improvement, but we are sitting below the state average in terms of our qualifications. And it's something that we think is really important for employment opportunities moving forward. Now, guys, you can change this drop down. I'll change it to Quilpie. And let's go straight down and have a look. Now we can see here just on par in terms of vocational studies, much higher in terms of no qualification compared to Queensland. And we've had an increase in vocational. So it's only small numbers, but a positive is a positive. So it's really about there. That tells me a story straight away around we need to have a think about how we encourage people to become more qualified in our community as well. We've also got our highest level of schooling. And now because I was on Quilpie, guys, it will keep me on Quilpie, okay? So I'm still on Quilpie Shire there, and we move down and we can see compared to Queensland, we have a lot less percentage of people finishing year 12 when we move down, but we can see there they're going to year 10. We can see our change in our highest level of schooling completed. Okay, what's this telling me? So we're having more people. What is this telling me? I'll have to look into that. Let's see, year 10 are equivalent and a decline. So this could be because of population decline. Yeah. Okay, so if you have population decline in Quilpie, this will be talking to me about you've just got less people in your community. So it's really interesting how we see that and what that means for our schools and funding for our schools as well. So guys, that's our who are we. When we come to what do we do, I'm not going to drill down into this area simply because we're about to click on the economy site, and that really talks to us a lot about what's happening in our economy. But I am going to talk to you guys about your households. And this is important as well for planning when you move forward and we talk about council's plans for new houses and what type of people are living in our communities as well. Talks about what sort of grant funding should we be looking at to support our lone persons in our community, our elderly couples without children, that sort of thing, our young workers that are coming to work in our communities. So we're still on Quilpie Shire here, guys, and we can see compared to Queensland, this high percentage of lone person households. Okay, when we move down, we can see once again, we've got this population decline coming through the data. So we'll shift over to Merway for a second. So I'm guessing it won't be as pronounced. And we'll just come up here. So once again, lone person household and couples without children are our predominant household types in the Merway region. Let's move down and see how that's changed. So our couples with children, okay, 83 less couples with children. So that has an impact on our schools, our workforce. We can see an increase in couples without children, increase in one-parent families, and an increase in lone person households. And this is where we're starting to see our greatest amount of growth in all regions. We're really seeing a lot of this lone person household. And what does that mean? And who are these lone person households? Are they made up of the elderly? Are they young workers? What does it actually look like for your particular region? And what sort of services do these guys need compared to other areas? Let's have a look at our household size. Okay, our dominant household size in Merway are two-person households, 2- and 1-person households, so smaller households. And we can see we've got decline across the board except in our 1-person households. What we can couple that up with, guys, is having a look at what our dwelling types are. So if I then want to say, okay, well, if we've got this increase in 1-person household, are we still building or do we only have available dwellings for families? And let's come down here and we can see majority of housing in this region are separate houses. We've got this small component of medium density. And this in the caravans, cabin, houseboats can be visitors during that August period in your region filling out the census. Let's have a look. So we've had an increase between 11 and 16. So you had more caravanners in there. You had a decline in separate houses, which is interesting. And you've had this increase in medium density, which is good to see.
Our next census is due next year?
Yeah, August next year. We'll all sit down and do the census. Yep. So guys, I'm going to leave the Indigenous profile in some of these tabs, and I'm going to come straight down to this job seeker data, because I think it's important for you guys just to follow along with this data as it comes out. So it talks about RDA, Darling Downs and Southwest at the top, but if we move down, you get the actual numbers in Balonne, Gundy, Maranoa, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see here in March 2020, there was 192 people in Balonne. Now there's 297 people on Job Seeker. So it's an increase of 105. So it's talking to me about exact numbers of people on Job Seeker benefits. So on Quilpie, we have an extra 21 people, 39 Peru, 90 in Merway, this sort of thing. So you're able to every month, so October will be updating this information. You'll be able to see, you know, that information from Department of Social Services to see how your region is tracking in terms of job seeker data. Okay, and then you've just got your chart below. This is probably one of those unusual times where I actually look at the data and talk about real numbers around what that means for us. The other thing you can do on this particular site, guys, is you can come down here to reports. I'm just going to come down. If I come down here to reports, and you can actually just print yourself out a report for whatever region you're looking at. So if I'm looking at just the overarching RDA DDSW region or one of these smaller guys, I can come in here into Merway. I've got my benchmark as Queensland. You can change that to regional Queensland, Australia, RDA, DDSW, and you can just click on these icons and come down the bottom, and you click on your email address and you send yourself the report in PDF or Word. My suggestion would be to send it in Word and then take out the information that you don't need or that's not relevant for you. So that's a really good little tool to use as well. So now we'll click on and go to the economic profile. And here I'm going to do the same thing, guys. I'm going to sort of go around the site and show you the bits that I think are possibly the most important for you to have a good understanding of. So the first thing I'm going to go to is your gross product. And once again, we can drill down into all of our smaller regions. So if we want to look at Merway, we can drill down into Merway, and we can see here, this is the same chart that I had in the presentation. So I can just copy that and place it straight into a PowerPoint presentation. And it gives me information on the gross regional product in Merway from 2001. That data will be updated in March or April, or well, February, March of next year. It also talks about our cumulative change compared to Queensland. So depending on what story you want to tell, you might want to use a different chart. So we can see here, here's our annual change in gross regional product compared to Queensland. When we come down here, we get our actual figures. So these are our quotables. When we go to the state government or the federal government, we say, well, our economy actually contracted during this period, and we would obviously like to grow our economy. So there's ways and means of being able to present the data. You can see how the change in Merway compared to Queensland. So we can see Queensland is on a growth trajectory, but we can see that Merway is shifting away from Queensland there. So that's our gross product. The next thing I want to look at is my local employment. So here I've gone to economic indicators, gross product, local employment. And we talk here about how many jobs. We've got 2,235 jobs located in the Merway Shire. And we can see how we had this peak number of jobs in 2012, and then we've been falling away ever since, and we're starting to almost plateau out at the bottom there. And you can see how our annual jobs change. So even though it's negative, it's not as negative as the previous year. So we're still below 0%. And we can see here those local jobs changes over time from 2001 as well. I'll just click on Quilpie for the second. Let's have a look. So there's 570 jobs located in the Quilpie Shire, and we can see how that those jobs have declined quite heavily from 2007 there at the peak. Move below, still below 0% jobs change. We've had negative jobs growth since 2007. So that's some really rich information to use as part of your applications. The next thing we go to is unemployment. So depending on what story you want to tell, some regions I go to have low numbers of jobs, but they have a very low unemployment rate as well. So we can see Quilpie Shire here. Great story to tell, 8.1% above both the regional Queensland and Australian average. Let's have a look at Merway. I think Merway's is quite low. So here we can see our quarterly unemployment's about 5.8% in March. It'll be interesting to see what we back that up with shortly in our Q2. And we can see all of those figures below, guys, and it actually gives you those real numbers as well. Building approvals is another one. So we go gross product, local employment, unemployment, and building approvals. Now, building approvals is important because it's going to talk to me about what the future might look like for this particular region. And we can see here, this is our building approvals as it sits at the moment. That's simply because it's just July, August data. So as we get more data, we'll continually update that. But that's something early in the new year that often councils will look at and say, okay, what do our building approvals look like? We need to get some stuff through the pipe. So it's really important that we continue to see growth in our building approvals. And when we come down here, we actually get our total values in terms of our building approvals as well. So that's another good one to look at to really talk to us about what the future might hold. The next area I'm going to go to is my economic value, and I'm going to look at value added. And the reason I want to look at value added is because it really talks to me about the productivity or the profitability of our industries in the region. And our most productive industry in Merway is ag, forestry and fishing, generating $42 million. When I come down here, guys, I'm going to change my comparison year, okay? Because what this is telling me is how have those industries changed over time? And what I want to know is how have they changed in the last year? Apologies. So next year, when the new data comes out, you will change that value to reflect 1819 versus 1920. Okay, so we'll start to see what have been those changes in the economy. So if we look at period prior to COVID and we wanted to say, okay, well, what's changed in our industries over that year? We can see that we had a decline in agriculture, and we can actually click on those sectors and we get all of our subsectors. So if we're looking at the tourism industry, and we know that retail trade makes up a component of that, and we want to think about, okay, well, what do we think is happening in tourism? We can click on retail trade and we can have a look down here and say, okay, well, food retailing is slightly up, but we're seeing these declines in other types of retailing. We've also got, where's our accommodation and food services is up a little bit. Food and bev services is up. And so we can go through this data and actually look at not only the sectors, but also the subsectors, which is really important because sometimes the sector doesn't tell us the full story. So we can see here defence has had a decline, but we've had an increase in public administration. Okay, education and training. We've had an increase in preschool and school education, no tertiary education, and there's probably a very small amount of increase in adult community and other education. Healthcare and social assistance, let's have a look at where our growth is. We're looking at hospitals, we've had a little bit of growth. residential care services, which is good because we saw that we had that increase in an aging population. So it's really important that as we look at this data to see whether or not the changes that we're seeing in our population are reflecting the changes that we're seeing in our industries as well. And then we get our charts down below as well. We've got here Merway compared to Queensland in terms of value add. And if I just hover over those tools, I can see finance and insurance services, ag, forestry and fishing, healthcare and social assistance are our largest industries in terms of value add. Then if I move down, I can see how this has changed. So how my industries have performed between 17-18 and 18-19. And we had this decline in ag, but we had growth in these sectors down below. Okay, once again, guys, we get our dominant emerging groups. You guys can use that information as much as you want. You can also export all of these tables and charts. Okay, so if you want to export this chart, you can export that into Excel or Word, and you can also export the entire page into a PDF. The next thing I'm going to look at is my exports. So one of the things we've been working with councils with at the moment is how exposed are we to international exports. Now I've just clicked on my export type and I've got total exports, and as I drill down you can see domestic versus international exports, and I'm going to click on international exports. And when we move down we can see our regions that have the highest exposure to international exports. We've got mining, oil and gas, manufacturing here. We've got a little bit of food product manufacturing, which is good because we've got a strong ag sector. So let's move down to our charts and we can see mining and manufacturing is where we have our greatest exposure in terms of international exports. Let's see how that's changed over time. So between 17, 18, 18, 19, we had an increase of 5 million in terms of mining and an increase of 1 million in manufacturing. And we can change that, guys, to domestic. If I move straight down to the bottom, let's see how that's changed over time. So our domestic market between 17, 18, that'd be related to the drought. 17, 18, 18, 19, we saw that decline here in our domestic exports, and that impacts our finance and insurance services as well. Once again, guys, you get your dominant and emerging groups down the bottom. Next thing we can look at is our local employment, and you can do the exact same thing that you did with your value add with your local employment. So if we come down here and we're looking at Merway and we're looking at our change in jobs over to the right here, as we scroll down and we can see manufacturing, we lost 14 workers, we lost 20 in retail trade. And you can click on here and see other store-based retailing, we lost 17 jobs. We gained 8 in food and bev services for accommodation and food services. We gained 9 in healthcare and social assistance, so mainly residential care services. So you can start to really break it down, guys. And you can do this for any region. So our biggest employer, ag, forestry and fishing, followed by healthcare, followed by retail, followed by public admin and safety, and education and training. Let's have a look at our changes. And here's our change in employment. So we had our 11 workers here in the aged care services, and we've also got accommodation and food services. There was some growth, so small numbers, but growth for a region like this. And we can see dominant and emerging groups as well.
No,
Comes into public admin. Yeah, so you'll have public administration. So it'll say 166. So you've got 210 in public admin, 166 in public administration. So in this, John, here, this one that I'm looking at here, is total jobs. So this could be part-time or, so, you know, it's, it's, you can look at your FTEs, but I tend to look at totals simply because now there's lots of people who choose part-time work. So, that's your employment total.
I just thought the public administration would be more prominent than it was on the graph.
Yep. So
health's a big one.
Health's a big one, yeah. So we can look here at industry focus. So if we want to look at a particular industry, so if we're coming down here and I really want to investigate what's happening in the retail sector. So I can come down here and click on, look at my subsectors. I'm moving down and I'm coming to retail trade, and I'm going to look at the total sector. Okay, I'm not going to break it down into one of its subsectors. I just want to look at retail trade. I've got my comparison year set at 17-18. And this talks to me about everything that's happening in your retail trade sector. So it talks to me about how many people are employed, how many are full-time employees, what's my output of that sector, my value add, what do we export, what do we import, what are local sales, what's my worker productivity per worker as well, and it compares it to 17-18, so we can see how things have either improved or fallen away. Talks to me about my economic output by destination. So here, you know, a lot of our retail is domestic exports. So this could be visitors coming in from outside of the region, local sales, and then we've also got a little bit of international exports out here. This also talks to us about our industry contribution to Queensland. So what does our retail sector actually provide to the Queensland economy as well? So we can do that for any industry. So if we want to look at how big our ag sector is compared to Queensland or Australia, all of that sort of thing. So it just gives you those really nice details around that industry sector. The other thing you can do is if we change that from industry sector analysis to time series, it shows me what has happened in that industry over time, which is really great to see, because if we think, it starts to dispel myths. If we think our retail industry has been growing and we start to go, well, actually, when we look at employment totals, you know, we've seen a decline in the retail sector or whatever it might be. So we can see Merway, Queensland, retail trade, and here on our measurement, I can look at this in terms of employment, output, value add, exports, imports, local sales, worker productivity. So a lot of that information that we were digging around for, we can now come here and actually just look at for that particular subsector. So we can see Merway, we can see the changes that have happened in the retail sector, okay, as we've lost those jobs over time. Shows us our time series compared to Queensland and our percentage of Queensland there as well. So it's a really interesting one, guys. If you've got a particular sector that you want to look at, or you want to think, you know, you're thinking, actually, we've been improving in terms of our food product manufacturing or our road transport, or we graded a road last year and therefore our road transport should have increased, or whatever it might be, you're able to look at this and see how that change has been enabled over time. Okay, the next thing we'll look at, guys, is our resident workers. So this gives me some key statistics on the type of people we have working in our community. So this is for all industries. So here we can see our total workers. So we've got 2,046 people that work in our community, almost a good balance there between males and females. Talks to me about my age structure of my workforce, the top 3 industries, the top 3 occupations, hours worked, whether they've got bachelor degrees, higher degrees, or no qualifications, what incomes they they have, whether their method of travel to work, this sort of thing. So it gives you some really good characteristics of your industries. It also talks to you about your individual industries. So if you're thinking about the manufacturing sector and you're going, well, we're going to have some growth in our manufacturing sector because we're investing some money into it. What do our people look like that are working in that industry? What do we need to find? Or are there some issues? Do we have too many people who are aged 65 years and over, or 55 to 64 years, that we need to think about our progression strategy for those guys as well? So it's a really nice tool to be able to see, well, what are the qualifications of my workers in this region? So that's our resident workers. I'm going to come down here now to tourism and hospitality, and I'm not sure how much information you guys are going to have on Merway Shire. So sometimes you're just too small to get really valuable, rich data, but we can see here our value of tourism and hospitality since sort of 2015, we've had a fall away in our output and total sales, and I'm assuming that's going to be reflected in terms of our tourism and hospitality employment. So this is an opportunity for this region. Tourism and domestic tourism and people getting out and about and travelling at the moment is high on the agenda, and particularly camping, caravanning, this sort of thing. I was in a caravan shop in Brisbane at the weekend, and oh my God, I have not seen so many people in a bloody camping shop. And I went to 3 different shops, and I just couldn't believe how many people, and they are just going gangbusters. They cannot keep up with sales. There's a year-long wait on family caravans at a number of places. It's really interesting how people are shifting their strategies around their holidaying and their movements. So let's have a look at our tourism visitor summary. Let's see what information we can get from Merway. So we don't have a lot of data there. So you can see there, that's just literally because there's just not the data sources. So this comes from Tourism Research Australia. And I'm sure, Peter, you probably know as well as I do how difficult and how, you know, the sort of that data set, it's not as reliable as others.
No, it's really difficult to see the relevance in the data that comes out of TRA. They are looking at some other data sets at the moment, and that may well change, you know, by the beginning of next year. So those data sets will be much better.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I'm optimistic, but it is difficult. It's really, really difficult. If you've ever done an exit survey from anywhere, they're really difficult things to fill out, particularly when you don't know the names of places or you can't attribute something.
It's the whole methodology, though. The methodology about how they collect their data is all wrong.
Yeah.
And there's so much better data elsewhere in the world. In fact, and Trudy knows this, and so does Karen. You know, we use device ID data. It's so much better. It's so much more accurate, and it's in the moment, and you can then take that data and do something with it, you know, whereas CRA data is 6 months old when you get it. What the hell do you do with it? So,
One thing we've been using at the moment, Peter, is Google Analytics data, and it's free at the moment.
And Google mobility data,
Google mobility data. We were just talking about at work the other day, saying we're not sure how long it will be free for, but it's given us some really great information. And it's really, for us, it's about dispelling the myths, because if I go to somewhere like Rockhampton or Yeppoon, they're telling me we're going gangbusters here. And yet when I look at their COVID data, they've got declines of 6 and 7%. So when I look at that, I think, okay, well, how can the local knowledge be telling me that we're going gangbusters when in actual fact, the JobKeeper data and other bits of data are telling me that it's not going so well. But the Google Analytics data is helping to be able to talk to us about what is actually happening in terms of people movement in those regions. So it's, it's a good one to have a look at.
Absolutely.
I'll send Trudy a link to that source as well. So here's where we get those COVID impacts, guys, and I'll click on here to Quilpie. Come down here and see what's happening in Quilpie. So Quilpie is another one with a positive change. So we can see this GRP change, local job change, employed resident change has been very strong growth. compared to regional Queensland and Australia. We can see ag is really supporting the region's growth, mining, wholesale trade, public admin. When we move down here, guys, we also get this great little tool that shows us our local jobs impact in September. And if I hover over these areas, we can see healthcare and social assistance. Local jobs change without JobKeeper is 2. Our local jobs change is 2. Our jobs compensated by JobKeeper is 1. Okay, so it just gives us those little bits of information. So there's very few residents in this region that are being compensated by JobKeeper. We can see 2 in healthcare and social assistance, 2 in accommodation food services, 1, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that Quilpie hasn't been greatly affected by the crisis as well. Here's all of our assumptions and methodology. So if you ever feel like you want to have a read of some really heavy sort of economics, here's a great little paper for you to take to bed and read that one.
No need for sleeping tablets.
No. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at, guys, is our economic impact model. Okay, and I'm just going to put us in for... I get this, I do this wrong every time. I think I spelled it wrong. Okay, so here we're on the economic impact model for Merway Shire.
So
okay.
This one is password protected, that you would have just seen Kat put that in. But for those who are using it a lot, you should already have access to the passwords. Once you've had this training, if you want access to the passwords, I'm always happy to give them out. And if you ever get stuck and you want these reports that Kat's about to show you through, and you're struggling with it or you can't find it, admin at the RDA email, so Tim Smith, shoot him an email, he can do these for you. And pretty much any economic development officer at any of our 10 councils have got access and have had training to this. So for community groups, you know that you can get a hold of John Nicholson here at Merway, or any of the other ED officers across our region, and they can help you out if you've gone and, you know, an emergency.
Cool. So with this one, guys, when we come down here, sorry, I'm going to go on to my economic impact model again. When we come into our economic impact model, it's really about thinking about the project, okay? And most of the time, our projects are going to have a construction phase and they're going to have an operational phase. So the first thing we'll do if we're going for a grant application and we want to build a community centre. So council has decided we want to build a new community centre. They would come down here and they would say building construction. So that's the first thing that we do, is we select our industry drop down. Then in here, we have to choose sales or jobs. Now we know that a construction project will always be quoted in sales. So it'll always be a $5 million project, or this is a $2 million project, or whatever it might be. So we come in here and we click sales. Now let's say that this project is a $6.5 million project for council. And I'll just put in here community centre. Okay, and I'll click submit through the model. And what that will do is that uses all of your data that we have for Merway Shire Council area, and it runs it all through the model. It uses the information around your journey to work data. It uses information around that I showed you on worker productivity, all of these types of things. It talks in the model to what those figures are, and it reverberates that through the economy. So the first thing we look at is our output in our building construction sector. Our starting position is 9.32 million. All industries in Merway is about 445 million. When we come down here, our direct impact on our building construction sector of this community centre is our starting position of $6.5 million. We can see our industrial impact is 4.51 million. So that's where we buy steel, we You know, we have all of these different inputs that we'll need to go into the project, the gardens, the fencing, all of that sort of stuff. Then we've got our consumption impact. So as those workers go out into the community and purchase food, haircuts, healthcare, whatever it might be, that's our consumption impact through the economy. So our total impact, we started with 6.5, is actually 13.83 million. Okay. Our type 1 multipliers, so these are our two multipliers. These are the numbers that we use to figure out what our industrial and our consumption impacts are. So those numbers tell us how money moves through your economy. So now we go to, so the first really important figure for you guys is your total impact on the Merwar Shire economy, which is 13.83 million in terms of output, and 60 local jobs, of which 56 will be taken up by local residents. 4 will be taken up by people outside of the region. Now, when we talk about that, that could be someone working in Sydney doing the design plans. That could be someone working in Townsville on the finance and insurance for this particular project. So there's different ways that that can be counted. Then we've come down here and we've got our impact on the Queensland economy. So straight down here, we got our impact outside the Shire. Our total impact is 15.98 million. Then we come down here and we've got our total impact on the Australian economy. And why those are important is because depending on what level of government you are going for your grant application will depend upon whether you use Queensland or you quote Australian figures. Okay, so then we move down the bottom and I'm going to show you something really cool. So guys, you can export that table into Excel or Word for your project. You can use directly that. It's got all of the references there for you. When you come down here, you get all of this information. So impact on output, the direct addition of 6.5 million annual output, blah, blah, blah. All of this information talks to the direct industrial and consumption effects. So you come down, impact on local employment, impact on value add, GRP, impact on employment by industry sector. It also talks to me about what other sectors we create employment in, because when we create jobs in the construction sector, we also create jobs in other sectors as well. And we can see there manufacturing, retail, accommodation and food services. This is one of the reasons why construction is such an important part of our economy, is simply because it has such a high multiplier outside of itself. So we can see construction, resident employment impacts, value added by industry. All of this information can be exported into Word or PDF. I would suggest when you run these models to export it into Word and then pick out the bits that the funding body has decided that they want to see. And sometimes, guys, they will say, well, we want to know what the impact is on Indigenous employment, or we want to know what the impact is on youth unemployment. Those sorts of things that are outside of the model, you can email to Tim or Trudy, and you're able to say to them, we need to actually, in this case, show our impact on Indigenous employment, and we can actually include those figures and help you guys to come up with that based on your Indigenous profile in your region. Okay, so that's how we use the economic impact model for building construction. If, say, for example, at this community centre, we are going to have some public administration, librarians, that sort of thing working. And let's say we're going to have 10 workers in this community centre. We would run that through, oops, sorry, I've got sales there, my bad. There, that's a good one to watch. Don't do what I do. Public administration, here I've got sales. I would pick jobs, because council would have said we're going to allocate 10 jobs to that community centre, and we would submit that through the model. Once again, guys, we got our starting position of public administration, we've got our all industries, and then we start to talk about our impacts. So our direct impact is about 1 million. When we come down here, our total impact on Merwar Shire economy is 1.61 million. Total impact on the Queensland economy is 1.79 million. The total impact on the Australian economy is 2.45 million. You get all of your information, once again, guys, all down here for you to export into Word and accompany that to your presentation, or your, sorry, not your presentation, your grant application as well. Okay, so you would have the construction phase, and then you would have the operational phase, and you would be going to the government and saying, this is going to be X amount in economic benefit for the community. So does that make sense?
Nobody's saying no, so I'm going to go with yes.
Yes, 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 yes.
Cool. So the next thing, the last thing I'm going to show you is that once again on this site, so on the red profile, we had our downloadables, our downloadable report. We've also got an economic overview, industry sector and employment report. So if you come on here into economic overview for Merway, and I can come down here and click all of these different variables that I looked at that you may like to look at. And then you can send yourself that information into a Word document or PDF as well. So you can get all of that information right there at your fingertips. Oh, and once again, guys, menu at the bottom of the economic profile, which is important as well. So any questions?
Guys, feel free to just come off mute because we haven't got too many on this one. So you're very lucky you get time to ask specific questions rather than typing them into chat.
Yeah, I've got no questions. I just want to say I love it. Just love the detail and how it interacts with one section to another. It's great.
Peter and I have only been saying for a year we need to catch up, and I'll take him on a tour. But you got the specialists today, Peter.
Yeah, I'd still love to talk to you, Trude, about the event and the events and that as well. So
yeah, the event impact tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, the event impact model is a little bit more. It's not more complicated. Well, it is a little bit. It's just ensuring that we put the right figures. That's one that once you run it a couple of times, you'll really get the hang of it, but it's just working through the different variables and that sort of thing.
Right.
Karen, Jenny, Rena, any questions? Or feel free, I've put in the chat both mine and Tim's contact details. So if it's not a project specifically you want to talk about publicly, you can always talk about to us confidentially, and we'll help you with reports. Jen, I see you're off mute.
Yeah, no questions, but thank you. That was really good, really informative.
And I see also Rena's put in the comments fab resource. So thank you. All right.
Yes, no, thank you very much. It was really good. So nice to have a refresher.
Yeah, Karen, we'll send you that initial PowerPoint though with specific Quilpie details. Because you registered for this, Tim will send you the Merway one automatically. We will send you a Quilpie one separately. So thank you, everyone. I want to take this moment to say thank you so much for Kat. We have got her on a whirlwind tour across Southwest. So she does Cunnamulla 5 till 7 tonight. So if you know of somebody that should be listening to this, even though it might not be their region's area, the Zoom links are all on Eventbrite, or shoot Tim an email and say, look, I specifically want, the Wednesday lunchtime one. He will send it to you so you can get somebody else to register if you think that, somebody else who would get value out of this tool. So we've got Cunnamulla 5 till 7 tonight. Tomorrow we've got St. George 12 till 2, then Gundy 5 till 7. And then on Wednesday, we've got Warwick 12 till 2. And then later that day, Kat will fall in a heap because we're working her very hard. So thank you so much, Kat, for coming on the road with us and sharing this information. And as we said, we will email everything, all the other information through, and even those brochures that I referred to, the Toowoomba Jobs Fair and the innovation, we'll send you a PDF of them so that you guys can actually use those for any businesses that you're dealing with. And if you're after staff, remember that one. And anything else, just feel free to shoot us an email through to RDA. So thanks everyone. If there's no further questions, we'll finish up 16 minutes early.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Bye.